Welcome back to the final episode here on The Toys That Made Us, at least episode 4 until they make the other 4, because there's going to be 8 episodes here. And if this is the first episode you've been watching on here, we are doing something a little different here on It Figures. We are actually reviewing a show on Netflix called The Toys That Made Us. And it's basically going back and looking at the franchise of the toy lines that we loved as a kid and how they created them. And the 4th episode is G.I. Joe.
A real American hero.
G.I. Joe is there.
Yo, Joe!
Let me go back a little bit here, Vince. I actually did play with G.I. Joes growing up. And this, again, like He-Man, G.I. Joe, I actually played more with G.I. Joe than I did He-Man. What they talk about in this series is true, is that my sister had all these Barbies, and she played with Barbies and loved Barbies. And then, of course, boys are like, oh, I can't play with those because those are for girls and blah, blah, blah. Then they came out with this toy line, and it's for boys, and it's Army, and it's like, you know, oh, I had to have it. I absolutely had to have G.I. Joe. And I remember having one G.I. Joe figure growing up, and it was called Eagle Scout. I think it was, Eagle Eye, something like that, Eagle Eye Scout or Eagle Eye or whatever, G.I. Joe. And it was the one that had the flocked hair with the beard, and you turned his head and his eyes went. They just went back and forth, and that's all it did. Oh my God, I thought it was the greatest thing ever, Vince.
And for my little history of G.I. Joe is, I had no idea what G.I. Joe was. I had no idea anything about G.I. Joe. I just remember getting a G.I. Joe for Christmas when I was like 4 or 5. I actually do remember having one. And I think I had 2 of them, and I had their van. I remember having the van with it. And there was all these accessories and stuff that you could put on the van, or the van had. It had all kinds of like bombs and guns and whatnot. And he had I think a turret and things like that. And I remember having the G.I. Joe with the beard. I don't know about his eyes. I don't remember if his eyes moved or not, but I had the one with the beard. And of course I was like 4, 5, 6 years old when I had it, so for me, it was a plaything. I didn't, it wasn't anything about Barbie. It wasn't anything about anything else. It was just, this was my toy, and that was one of the first, I will say this, it was one of the first action figures I ever actually owned, was a G.I. Joe action figure.
Now, I'm going to tell you something, and I've been doing this a lot lately on these videos, especially Box Office Maniacs, that I've never said to anybody before. This is, when I was growing up, this is personal stuff. There was a kid that lived in my neighborhood, and I think his name, if I can remember right, his name was Sean, I think his name was. And Sean was like, he was sort of, he wasn't the bully of the town, or of the block or whatever.
He's the bully of the town. St. Louis of the town.
Like in Stand By Me, the tough guy, I'm talking about, the tough kid. And like the other movie you probably never watched was The Monster Squad. They get the tough kid, and he comes into the group with all the nerdy kids. You know what I'm talking about? And he becomes one of them. And he was like that. And he would play with G.I. Joe with me all the time. But he was a tough kid, and he didn't want anyone else to know he played with G.I. Joe. And I still remember to this day getting that Eagle Eye G.I. Joe. And he had like a sand pit outside of his house. His house was the last house on the block. And right from his house to the other house, there was like a side street. So he just had a side of his house where no other houses there. And he had all this sand, a bunch of sand, like whatever, I don't know why it was there. But I would go over there and play with my G.I. Joe with him in this sand pit. And we would have adventures with these 12-inch figures. I still remember that, and that's one of my fond memories of playing with that G.I. Joe.
You played in the ash can of the local. That's where all the bums threw their cigarettes, man.
Yeah, probably. That's where all the cigarettes were.
So the 1980s come out, and of course by this time Star Wars had come out, and the whole Star Wars action figure line had come out, and I was collecting a lot of the Star Wars figures. Me and my brother actually both were collecting a lot of the Star Wars figures, but I gravitated more to Star Wars than I did G.I. Joe. But when the G.I. Joe cartoon came out, that's when my brother got into G.I. Joe. And he would, every day after school, we would come home and watch He-Man. We would watch G.I. Joe. We would watch those cartoons, mostly those two cartoons, religiously. Like every afternoon when we got home from school, we watched He-Man and G.I. Joe.
But at that point, it was the small G.I. Joes. The big G.I. Joes were gone when the cartoon came out. And that's when I think the smaller ones came out. I don't think they had the bigger ones then anymore.
The smaller ones came out because of Star Wars. They decided to change the action figure line to the 3 3/4 action figures to compete with Star Wars. But the difference that they did was, of course, they made them very posable, which is what the original action figure of G.I. Joe was very posable. You could put them in all different poses. And I always thought that was one of the coolest things about the G.I. Joe action figure line in the 80s, was that you could pose them in different things. And I always sat there and thought, man, I really wish they would do this with the Star Wars figures. And they eventually did, flash forward into the 90s with Star Wars. Eventually they did do that. They did start to make them to where you could actually bend their arms and bend their legs and make them a little more posable. But they didn't always work right. And sometimes you would lose pieces and they would fall off and everything with them. So with G.I. Joe, they definitely cornered the market on that. And they were able to make figures where you could pose them in all different poses. And I always thought that was one of the coolest details about the G.I. Joes.
So talking about the show here a bit. Now, I watched it a while ago, and Vince just watched it yesterday, so he's going to have to jog my memory here. But I think some guy actually created the G.I. Joe line, didn't he? And he took it to this company, Hasbro, and he's like, look, I want to make an army guy figure, and they're like, no. And then they sent him away. But then wasn't there like a guy who said, well, we need to like maybe look into this a little bit more or something like that?
Yeah, I believe so. It was something along that line. I'm trying to remember it myself. But yeah, I believe it was along that line. Like at first they said no. I mean, they said no right away. And the reason being was because they were like, well, it's war. You know, it's military, it's war. And things like that. And they were like, no, we don't need anything like that. But they were also into Mr. Potato Head and things like that. Things that were really, they were toys, but they weren't really boys or girls toys, and they were just toys. They were just, you know, they had a whole line of baseballs or whatever, you know, that kind of thing. What they did was bring this guy back, and they said, okay, well, we do want to make an action figure line. What do you got in mind? And he came up with the G.I. Joe thing, again, pitched them the G.I. Joe thing, and they said, okay, well, we'll buy you out. We'll buy this idea from you for they gave him two options of two deals. He could either get $50,000 and get a small percentage of the royalties of G.I. Joe if it worked, or $100,000 and then walk away from it. And the guy ended up taking the $100,000 and walking away from it, which his son now regrets that he really did.
Yeah, I think I would too, actually.
So then later on, when they finally brought it out, they decided to pitch it to the main guy at Hasbro. And at first he was like, no, that's not going to work. That's not going to work for us. He didn't even want to look at it. But then he was going on like vacation. So they were like, well, he's gone for 2 weeks. Let's do something and bring it back and pitch it to him again. The one guy that was really wanting to bring out this toy line, he decides to walk past his town, and he's walking past the tough town there without the tough guy. He's walking by this window of this art store, and he sees this posable thing that you use to draw from, you know, that you can put a figure in all different poses. And he buys like 12 of them and brings them to the guys at the design place in Hasbro and says, we've got to make a line out of these. And then when the guy gets back, we're going to pitch this to them. So that's what he did. And they start putting on all the details, all the clothes and everything. Gave him little machine guns and whatnot. And then they pitched it to the guy again. And then the guy was like, okay, we'll do it.
So I'm going to turn my green screen off here for a second, because obviously the G.I. Joe I have here is in camouflage. So, poof! Okay, green screen is off. But this is what it came out with. And I didn't even know it. This actually came out longer than a couple years ago. And I only ever seen it one time at the store, and I grabbed it. I snatched it. I believe it was Toys R Us that had this thing. And this is what the original packaging looked like when it came out in the... What year did this come out? In the 70s, 80s? Something like that?
The original line? Yeah, it came out in like I think it came out in the 50s. 50s or 60s.
But this is what you would get. You would get this cardboard box, and inside of it, you have the G.I. Joe. And this is not the one that is, eyes turn, but this is the way it looked like. And again, after this review, I'm going to go into much more detail about this guy. But this is what it was. This is what the original G.I. Joe came out with. And they were talking about these things were pretty expensive. And they didn't think, the parents would buy these for their kids. But because they were well constructed and they have thick clothing and, they're just really well-made figure, they bought them. And even though they cost a lot back then, they did. They bought these for the kids because they saw the quality of these figures.
Well, what it was, I remember now, it came out in like the late 60s, because then they were talking about the Vietnam War, which was during the late 60s and early 70s. So they didn't think they could really sell them like, to kids, because, the Vietnam War happened. And it wasn't until that point that I guess their sales dropped after that. And the big dolls kind of went away. And it just, they weren't doing anything with the line during the last half of the 70s. And then it was until about the middle of the 80s that they brought out the new line and brought out the 3 3/4 figures to match the Star Wars line that was already a huge hit.
And what they did with the cartoon was every week, or just about every week, it was it ended on a cliffhanger, or every day. I mean, it was on every day. And that was one of the very first soap operas that I ever watched. Could not wait to get home, especially the Serpentor story. I don't know if you remember that, when they were trying to bring back Serpentor. It went on for like 7, 8 episodes, and every single day it was to be continued. I was like, oh my God, I can't wait to find out what happened to Serpentor. And it was great, especially for kids. Literally, it was a soap opera for kids, and it was good. And that's the other thing is, it was good. It was really well told, really, really well animated. And again, they didn't use bullets, they used laser guns. But they still shot people, and people still blew up and whatever. But it was cool, and I love the sound of the laser guns. I always thought that was a cool sound they came up with lasers. Out
of the G.I. Joes, one of my favorite action figures was Snake Eyes. I love Snake Eyes, of course. Everyone loves Snake Eyes. But one of my favorite figures of G.I. Joe was Blowtorch. I absolutely love Blowtorch. I love the way he looked. He was all orange and red.
Yeah, I was going to say Zartan, when he came out, he was, oh wow. I mean, because he changed colors, I think. It was something, either got him wet or you took him out in the sun and he changed, he turned blue or something like that.
Another big thing about the G.I. Joe line in the 80s was all the vehicles. And of course, the big flagship toy of G.I. Joe was the USS Flag, the battleship, the aircraft carrier of G.I. Joe. And I remember getting that finally, and we got it from a friend of ours. Actually, my brother was more into G.I. Joe than I was, and he's the one that collected a lot of the G.I. Joe figures and a lot of the G.I. Joe, the hovercraft and all the vehicles and the planes and that, and he eventually finally got the aircraft carrier. But by the time he got the aircraft carrier, G.I. Joe was actually going out again, where it wasn't near as popular. And it was still kind of popular with us, and we still, we actually did what they kind of suggested in here with G.I. Joe, is that we would take the G.I. Joe figures and take the Star Wars figures, and we made, G.I. Joe part of the Star Wars universe. So like the aircraft carrier became like a Star Destroyer almost. So that's what we ended up doing with it. And this thing is massive. It's huge. It's so big. I don't have any, even though I still own it at this moment, I don't have anywhere to display it. I don't have anywhere to put it because it's just massive.
And again, I have not seen yet a bad episode of this show. Again, this is a great episode. And the way it's made is good. And it's entertaining, and it keeps it entertaining. And, it flows really well, and it goes really quick, and it gives you all this information. And then at the same time, you have this nostalgic factor watching it, and you're like, oh man, this is great. And it's like, everything a toy collector really likes all in this one show, and it's great. And because of that, I am giving the 4th episode of Toys That Made Us, the G.I. Joe episode, a 5 out of 5.
And of course, I'm also giving it a 5 out of 5. I absolutely love this show. So far, I've loved the series. I think I've given all of them 5 out of 5. Each one of these series, each one of these shows, episodes, have been fantastic. And they're teaching me a lot of what I didn't know. And that's what I really like about them. And yeah, like you said, they keep showing stuff that, I sit back and I go, man, I remember that. Man, I remember that. Oh, wow. I haven't seen that in so long. And that was one thing about G.I. Joe as well, is there's a guy in there that talks about it, and he says, I remember having that, every time they would show a new vehicle or something, I want that vehicle. I had that vehicle. Or, they look back at it now and say, man, I had the hovercraft, and I had Zartan's ship, and I had, I had all kinds of stuff from G.I. Joe, and I just loved it. And like I said, we often played with our Star Wars figures with it. So we made a whole new world out of that anyway, expanded universe for Star Wars with G.I. Joe.
I would love, if they did a $6 million man, I don't know if that was a big enough line to do an entire show over, but if they did, oh man, that would be it. Because that's one of my all-time favorite lines when I was growing up. My all-time favorite figures was $6 Million Man. But I think, again, Matchbox probably, Lego, maybe Cabbage Patch Kids, Transformers. Obviously, it's going to be Transformers because that was one of the big ones of the 80s.
So that's it for this episode. There's going to be more. There's, like David said, there's going to be more to the series. But for now, what you guys got to do is subscribe to us and leave us comments. Write down in the comments and like us and hit the little bell up there and everything, so when we post more videos. Please do that, and we'll see you next time on